Sometimes the most expensive things in life come with the smallest price tags. Margaret Whitmore stood in the dusty livestock barn outside Millbrook, Iowa, watching a skeletal mare that should have been put out of her misery months ago. The autumn wind rattled the corrugated roof, while other bidders avoided eye contact with the pitiful creature, whose ribs showed through her matted coat like prison bars. $1, the auctioneer called half-heartedly. "Do I hear $1 for this old girl?" Margaret's hand shot up before her practical mind could stop her. Back home, her husband Frank sat staring at their kitchen wall, lost again in the fog that had been stealing him away piece by piece for 3 years. They barely had enough money for his medications, let alone a dying horse, but something about the mare's eyes, ancient, knowing, almost human, whispered that this wasn't about charity. 3 days later, Margaret discovered the impossible. The horse was getting younger, and Frank had just asked her about their grandchildren by name for the first time in 2 years. What price would you pay to get back the person you love most? And would you pay it again if you discovered the true cost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Whitmore had always prided herself on being a woman who dealt in facts. 40 years as a librarian had taught her to catalog information, cross-reference sources, and never trust a single account without verification. But standing in her kitchen at 6:30 on a Thursday morning, watching her husband Frank butter toast with the careful precision he'd lost years ago, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the world. "The yellow jam, Maggie," Frank said, his voice clear and present in a way that made her chest tighten. Sarah always loved the apricot preserves when she visited. "Is she coming for Thanksgiving this year?" Sarah, their daughter Sarah, who lived in Portland now with her own family. Frank hadn't spoken her name coherently in 18 months. Margaret's coffee mug trembled in her hands. Through the kitchen window, she could see the old barn where the mare, Sorrow, the trader had called her, stood in the stall they'd hastily prepared. Yesterday, the horse's coat had been dull and patchy, her movements slow and labored. This morning, when Margaret had gone to feed her, she could have sworn the animal's eyes were clearer, her stance more steady. "I'll call Sarah later," Margaret managed, her voice catching. "She'd love to hear from you." Frank nodded and took another bite of toast. Normal, present, like the man she'd married 54 years ago was sitting at her table instead of the hollow shell who usually spent mornings staring at breakfast as if he'd forgotten what food was for. The rational part of her mind, the librarian part, scrambled for explanations. Dementia had good days and bad days. Everyone knew that. Sometimes patients experienced moments of clarity, brief windows where the fog lifted. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything. But as Frank reached across the table to squeeze her hand, his touch warm and intentional, Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Hope, maybe, or fear. Sometimes they wore the same face. "I need to check on the horse," she said, standing abruptly. "That old mare you brought home?" Frank's eyes followed her to the door. Shame, the shape she was in. But animals have a way of surprising you, given half a chance. Margaret paused, her hand on the doorknob. Frank's words carried the weight of old wisdom, the kind of understanding that had drawn her to him decades ago when they were both young and believed in impossible things. The barn door creaked as she stepped inside, morning light filtering through gaps in the weathered wood. The familiar smell of hay and dust surrounded her, but underneath it was something else, something green and vital that hadn't been there before. Sorrow stood in her stall, head raised, ears pricked forward with interest. The mare's coat, while still rough, seemed to catch the light differently. Her movements as she turned toward Margaret held none of yesterday's painful stiffness. "What are you?" Margaret whispered, approaching the stall slowly. The horse regarded her with those unsettling eyes, too knowing, too aware. Up close, Margaret could see that what she'd taken for cataracts yesterday appeared to be clearing, revealing depths that seemed to hold their own light. She'd been around horses as a girl, before her father sold their farm and moved the family to town. She knew their eyes, their expressions, the way they communicated through subtle shifts in posture and breath. This was different. This was like looking at something that was wearing a horse's shape but was fundamentally other. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Sarah's number flashed on the screen. "Mom?" Her daughter's voice carried across the miles, tight with concern. "I just had the strangest thing happen. I was thinking about Dad this morning, and I felt like I should call. Is everything okay?" Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Your father asked about you at breakfast, by name." Silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Mom, that's not," the doctor said. "I know what the doctor said." Margaret kept her eyes on Sorrow, who stood perfectly still, as if listening. "But he's different today. Clearer. Like himself again." Another pause. "I could drive down this weekend. Bring the kids. He'd like that." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "He'd like that very much." After she hung up, Margaret remained in the barn, studying the mare who somehow seemed to be studying her back. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows between the stalls, and in that golden light she could see it clearly now, the subtle changes that defied explanation. Sorrow's coat was definitely fuller, her frame less gaunt. The transformation was slow but unmistakable. And upstairs in their farmhouse, her husband of 5 decades was humming an old song while he washed dishes, something he hadn't done in 3 years. Margaret Whitmore had spent her life organizing information into neat categories, believing that everything had its proper place and logical explanation. But as she stood in that dusty barn, watching an impossible horse grow younger while her husband's mind cleared like morning fog, she began to suspect that some stories were too strange for any catalog to contain. The question that frightened her most wasn't how this was happening. It was what would be required to make it continue. Margaret forced herself to turn away from Sorrow's penetrating gaze and walk back to the house, where Frank's humming drifted through the screen door like a melody from another life. Inside, she found him at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, methodically washing their breakfast dishes with the same careful attention he'd once brought to his carpentry work. For a moment, she simply watched him, memorizing the slope of his shoulders, the way his silver hair caught the morning light, the precise movements of his weathered hands. This was the Frank she'd fallen in love with, present, purposeful, wholly himself. The Frank who used to build her bookshelves with joints so perfect they never needed a single nail, the Frank who remembered their anniversary, their daughter's birthday, the way she liked her coffee, the Frank she'd been grieving for 3 long years while his body remained, and his mind slowly slipped away. "Maggie?" He turned, offering her the dish towel with a smile that reached his eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost." If only it were that simple. "Just thinking," she said, accepting the towel and hanging it on its hook by the window. Everything in its place, the way she'd organized their life together. Routines had become her anchor as Frank's world grew smaller and more confused. "Dangerous habit at our age," Frank chuckled, then paused, his brow furrowing. "Though I feel like I've been in a fog for... How long has it been since I felt this clear?" The question hung between them like a bridge Margaret was afraid to cross. How could she tell him about the lost months, the forgotten conversations, the mornings when he'd looked at her like a stranger? How could she explain the slow death of watching someone disappear piece by piece while their body remained? "It doesn't matter," she said instead, touching his cheek. "You're here now." The phone rang, startling them both. Margaret recognized Mrs. Chen's number from down the road. "Margaret? I hope I'm not calling too early. Tom's truck won't start, and I wondered if Frank might take a look. He always had such a way with engines." Margaret's throat tightened. Frank hadn't worked on an engine in years. The last time he'd tried to help a neighbor, he'd stood in their driveway for 20 minutes, staring at an open hood like he'd never seen a car before. "I'll ask him," she managed. "Who was that?" Frank appeared at her elbow, alert and interested. "The Chens. Tom's truck is giving him trouble." Frank was already reaching for his jacket. "Better grab my tools. Probably the alternator. That old Ford's been on its last legs for months." Margaret's heart stuttered. Frank remembered Tom's truck. He remembered it was a Ford, remembered its problems. 6 months ago he'd forgotten their mailman's name. She followed him to the garage, watching as he selected tools with the confidence of long practice. His movements were sure, automatic, muscle memory asserting itself as his mind cleared. This was the man who'd kept their farm running for decades, who could diagnose a problem by the sound an engine made, who neighbors called when they needed something fixed right. This was the man she'd been losing, inch by inch, day by day. At the Chen's place, Margaret stood beside Helen Chen, both women watching their husbands bend over the truck's engine. Tom was explaining the symptoms while Frank listened, nodded, then dove in with practiced ease. "He seems so much better today," Helen murmured, her voice carefully neutral. The whole town knew about Frank's condition. In a place like Millbrook, everyone's business was everyone's business, shared over coffee at the diner and discussed in hushed tones at church. "Good day," Margaret replied, the words tasting like dust in her mouth. Helen squeezed her arm. "We've been praying for you both. This disease, it's cruel." Disease. The word sat heavy between them. Alzheimer's was what Dr. Patterson had called it, though the diagnosis had taken months to pin down. Tests and consultations, driving to Des Moines for specialists who asked Frank to remember 3 words, draw a clock, tell them what year it was. The slow accumulation of evidence that the mind she'd loved for 5 decades was breaking down, neurons firing wrong, memories dissolving like sugar in rain. "There's your problem," Frank called out, his voice carrying satisfaction. "Corroded battery terminal. Give me 5 minutes and she'll purr like a kitten." Tom Chen beamed, clapping Frank on the shoulder. "I should have called you first. You always know what's what." Driving home, Margaret felt the weight of the morning settling over her like a familiar coat. This was her life now, stolen moments of clarity surrounded by the constant threat of loss, the knowledge that tomorrow, or next week, or next month, Frank might wake up and not know where he was again, might look at her with polite confusion, or worse, fear. She'd built their routine around his limitations, simplified their world to accommodate his shrinking reality. Labeled cabinets, established patterns, reduced their rich, complex life to its essential elements, safety over adventure, predictability over possibility. But today felt different. Today felt like a door opening to a room she'd thought was locked forever. Back in their kitchen, Frank made them lunch with steady hands, talking about calling Sarah, about projects he wanted to tackle around the farm. Normal conversation, normal plans, normal hope. Margaret listened and responded, and pretended her hands weren't shaking, because she knew that tomorrow might steal all of this away again. And she was beginning to suspect that something impossible was the only thing standing between them and that particular darkness. Through the window, she could see sorrow in the pasture, moving with increasing grace, and Margaret wondered what price miracles demanded. The first sign that something truly impossible was happening came at 3 in the morning, when Margaret woke to find Frank's side of the bed empty. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she sat up, listening to the silence that had become her enemy. For the past year, Frank had been a restless sleeper, often wandering the house in confusion, sometimes trying to leave because he thought he was late for work at the carpentry shop he'd retired from 15 years ago. She'd installed locks, hidden keys, turned their home into a gentle prison to keep him safe. The floorboards creaked overhead in the attic. Margaret grabbed her robe and followed the sound, climbing the narrow stairs she hadn't used in months. The attic door stood open, spilling yellow light into the hallway. Inside, she found Frank kneeling beside an old cedar chest, surrounded by photograph albums and manila folders she'd stored away years ago. "Frank?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He looked up, his face illuminated by the bare bulb overhead, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not confusion, recognition, complete, devastating awareness. "Maggie." His voice was steady, certain. I remember everything." The photographs scattered around him told the story of their life together. Their wedding day, Sarah's first steps, Christmas mornings and summer vacations and ordinary Tuesday evenings that had meant everything. But it was the manila folder in his hands that made Margaret's chest tighten with a fear she couldn't name. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. Frank held up a birth certificate yellowed with age. Not Sarah's, another child, a boy. The name read Thomas Daniel Whitmore, and the death date was recorded just 3 days after birth. "Our son," Frank said quietly, "the baby we lost before Sarah. You made me promise never to talk about it, said it hurt too much to remember. But I remember now, Maggie. I remember all of it." Margaret sank onto an old trunk, the attic suddenly feeling too small, the air too thin. She'd buried those memories so deep, she'd convinced herself they weren't real anymore. The pregnancy that came 2 years after their marriage, the complications, the tiny boy who'd lived just long enough for them to name him and love him and lose him. "That was 50 years ago," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "50 years ago, we drove to that traveling fair outside Cedar Rapids. You were still grieving, still broken, and you thought maybe getting out would help." Frank's eyes never left hers. "There was a woman there, in one of those carnival wagons. She said she could help us, said she could give us what we'd lost." Margaret's hands began to shake. She remembered the fair, the smell of cotton candy and diesel fuel, the flashing lights that had seemed too bright against her grief. She remembered being desperate enough to follow Frank to a wagon painted with symbols she didn't recognize, where an elderly woman with silver hair had offered them tea that tasted like herbs and promises. "You told her no," Margaret said, the memory surfacing like something dredged up from deep water. "You said some prices were too high to pay. But you went back." Frank's voice was gentle, but it cut through her like a blade. "After I fell asleep that night in the motel, you went back to her wagon." The photograph albums suddenly felt like evidence of a crime. Every image of Sarah, every birthday and graduation and wedding photo, all of it built on a choice Margaret had made in desperate grief 50 years ago, a choice she'd somehow forgotten until this moment. "She said the magic would sleep until I needed it most," Margaret whispered, the words coming from a place deeper than conscious memory. "She said when I was facing the greatest loss of my life, it would awaken." Frank reached across the scattered photographs and took her hand. His touch was warm, real, completely present. "The horse, Maggie. It's connected to what you did that night, isn't it?" Through the small attic window, Margaret could see the barn where Sorrow stood in her stall. Even from this distance, even in the darkness, she could sense the mare's awareness, like a pulse in the night air. "I don't remember making any bargain," she said. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't entirely true. There were gaps in her memory of that night, spaces where something important had been deliberately forgotten. Frank squeezed her fingers. "Whatever you did, whatever price you paid, it's not finished, is it?" Margaret looked at the photographs scattered around them, at the evidence of their life together, at the man she'd loved for more than 50 years who was suddenly, impossibly himself again. Tomorrow she would need to make a choice. Tomorrow she would need to decide whether to chase this miracle to its conclusion or let sleeping magic lie. But tonight, in the yellow glow of the attic bulb, she simply held her husband's hand and wondered what kind of debt came due after half a century of forgetting. The morning found Margaret sitting at her kitchen table, coffee growing cold in her cup as she stared out at the barn where Sorrow moved with increasing vitality. Beside her, Frank hummed softly while reading yesterday's newspaper, actually reading it, following the words with his finger, the way he used to when concentrating on something important. She should have been rejoicing. Instead, terror sat in her stomach like a stone. What if this was temporary? What if whatever force had awakened in that old mare decided to withdraw its gift as suddenly as it had appeared? The thought of watching Frank slip away again, of seeing recognition fade from his eyes after having it restored so completely, felt worse than any loss she'd already endured. And what if it wasn't temporary? What if the price she'd somehow forgotten was still waiting to be collected? "You're thinking too loud," Frank said, without looking up from his paper. It was something he used to tell her during their early years of marriage, when she'd lie awake worrying about bills, or the farm, or whether they'd ever have children after losing Tommy. Margaret's breath caught. "You remember saying that to me before?" Frank set down the newspaper and looked at her with eyes that held 47 years of shared mornings. I remember everything, Maggie. Every fight we had about money when we were young, every time you sang while doing dishes because you thought I couldn't hear you from the other room, the way you cried the night we decided to try for another baby after Tommy died. Each recovered memory felt like a small miracle and a fresh wound. This was what she'd been grieving, not just Frank's presence, but the loss of their shared history. All those moments that existed only because two people had lived them together, had built a life from the accumulation of ordinary days. The doctor said those memories were gone, she whispered. Dr. Patterson said the damage was irreversible. Maybe it was, Frank said quietly. Maybe some things require more than medicine to heal. Through the window, Margaret watched Sorrow canter across the pasture with fluid grace that should have been impossible for an animal who'd barely been able to walk 3 days ago. The mare's coat gleamed in the morning sun, her movements carrying the power and beauty of a horse in her prime. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. Defied everything Margaret understood about the world and its rules. Horses didn't grow younger. Alzheimer's didn't reverse itself. Miracles didn't arrive disguised as dollar bargains at livestock auctions. What if someone comes looking for her? The question escaped before Margaret could stop it. Frank raised an eyebrow. The horse? What if that trader realizes what he sold us? What if there are others who know what she really is? Margaret's voice rose slightly. What if we're stealing something that doesn't belong to us? And what if we're not? Frank countered gently. What if this is exactly what's supposed to happen? Margaret stood abruptly, pacing to the sink where she could see the barn more clearly. I spent my whole career organizing things, Frank. Books have call numbers, stories have beginnings and endings, everything has its proper place. This doesn't fit anywhere. Life isn't a library, Maggie. It should be. The words came out sharper than she intended. It should make sense. There should be rules and reasons and explanations that don't require believing in impossible things. Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the patient attention she remembered from their courtship, when he'd listened to her dreams of becoming a librarian and never once suggested she should want something smaller. You're afraid, he said finally. Margaret's shoulders sagged, terrified. Of losing me again? Of what it might cost to keep you. She turned from the window, meeting his gaze. I made some kind of bargain 50 years ago, something I can't fully remember. What if the price comes due, and it's not just my life? What if it's Sarah's, or the grandchildren's? What if I've traded their future for these extra days with you? Frank stood and crossed to her, taking her hands in his calloused palms. What if the price is already being paid? What if that mayor out there isn't here to collect a debt, but to settle one? Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to sink into the comfort of his certainty, the way she had when they were young and the world seemed full of possibilities instead of dangers. But 5 decades of living had taught her that gifts this precious always came with hidden costs. I don't know how to trust this, she admitted. Then don't, Frank said simply. Trust me instead. Trust us. We've survived worse things than miracles, Maggie. Outside, Sorrow raised her head toward the house, and Margaret could swear the mare was listening to every word, waiting for a decision that would determine not just their future, but the completion of something that had begun long ago in a carnival wagon, with promises made in desperate grief. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to believe in impossible things. Margaret stood in the space between heartbeats, between the life she understood and the mystery that called to her from the barn. Frank's hands were warm around hers, steady as they'd been on their wedding day, when she'd promised to follow him anywhere. Now he was asking her to follow him somewhere she couldn't map, couldn't catalog, couldn't file away in neat categories. Okay, she whispered, the word barely audible. Then, stronger, okay. Frank's smile was the same one that had convinced her to marry a carpenter's apprentice instead of the banker her mother had preferred. Okay? I need to know. Margaret pulled her hands free, not to escape but to move. I need to remember what I've forgotten, even if it terrifies me. Especially if it terrifies me. She walked to the kitchen drawer where she kept the farm's important papers. Deed, insurance, veterinary records. Her fingers moved past familiar folders to the very back, where something wrapped in old tea towels waited. She hadn't consciously put it there, couldn't remember moving it from wherever it had lived for 50 years, but her hands knew exactly where to find it. The leather journal felt warm against her palms, as if it had been sitting in sunlight instead of buried in darkness. The cover bore her maiden name in faded gold lettering, Margaret Rose Patterson. Below that, in handwriting she recognized as her own but couldn't remember forming for when the time comes. "I wrote this," she said, her voice filled with wonder and dread. "But I don't remember writing it." Frank moved beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence like an anchor. "Maybe you weren't supposed to remember. Maybe the remembering had to wait until now." Margaret opened the journal to the first page. Her younger self's handwriting flowed across the yellowed paper in careful script. April 15th, 1973. "I have made a choice that will echo through decades. The woman in the carnival wagon," she called herself Vera, "warned me that the magic would extract its own price in its own time. She said I would forget the bargain until the moment came to fulfill it. She said forgetting was a mercy, that carrying such knowledge would poison every happy day between then and now." Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the page. More of her handwriting, describing details that made her chest tight with recovered memory. "The spell requires 3 elements: a vessel, a purpose, and a sacrifice. The vessel will come disguised as something broken, something no one else wants. The purpose is love, not the easy love of good times, but the desperate love that refuses to let go even when holding on seems impossible. The sacrifice." Margaret stopped reading, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What does it say?" Frank asked gently. "The sacrifice is choice itself," Margaret read aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "When the vessel's purpose is fulfilled, I must choose, keep what the magic has restored and lose myself in its service, or release the magic and accept that some losses are meant to be permanent." Frank was quiet for a long moment. Outside, sorrow whinnied, not the weak sound of the dying horse they brought home, but the clear, strong call of an animal in her prime. "So that's it then," Frank said finally. "That's the price. Your freedom, or my memories." Margaret looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the man she'd married, but the sum of all their years together. The young father who'd walked the floors with colicky Sarah. The middle-aged husband who'd held her through her mother's funeral. The grandfather who'd taught their grandchildren to fish in the creek behind the barn. The man who'd disappeared piece by piece into the fog of disease until yesterday, when a broken horse had somehow brought him back. "There has to be another way," she said. But even as she spoke, she was already moving toward the door. "There has to be something else I can offer. Maggie, wait." But she was already outside, already walking across the yard with purpose burning in her chest. The journal clutched against her heart, Frank's footsteps following behind her, and ahead of her the barn where sorrow waited. The mare stood in her stall, no longer the skeletal creature they'd purchased for $1, but magnificent, powerful, timeless. Her dark eyes held depths that spoke of years beyond counting, of magic older than the farmland around them, of bargains made in desperation and paid for in the fullness of time. "I remember now," Margaret said, approaching the stall with steady steps. "I remember all of it." Sorrow's head turned toward her, ears pricked forward, and Margaret felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a mantle she'd been meant to wear all along. Behind her, Frank's voice carried love and fear in equal measure. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, we'll do it together." Margaret smiled without turning around, her hand reaching for the stall door latch. "Yes," she said quietly, "together. Just like we promised." She opened the gate and stepped across the threshold into the unknown. The moment Margaret's foot crossed the threshold into Sorrow's stall, the world shifted around her like pieces of a kaleidoscope finding their pattern. The barn walls seemed to breathe, expanding outward until they encompassed not just the weathered wooden structure Frank had built 30 years ago, but something vast and ancient that existed beyond the boundaries of their Iowa farm. Sorrow turned to face her fully, and Margaret found herself looking not at a horse, but at something that wore the shape of one. The mare's eyes held starlight and sorrow, wisdom and warning, and when she spoke, not with her voice but directly into Margaret's mind, her words carried the weight of centuries. "You have called the debt due," Sorrow said without speaking. "Are you prepared to learn what it truly means?" Margaret felt Frank's presence behind her, solid and real, but the sensation of his hand touching her shoulder came as if through deep water. "I'm prepared," she said aloud, though her voice sounded strange in the transformed space. The barn around them shimmered and became something else, a crossroads where 5 paths stretched away into different versions of darkness and light. At the center stood a figure Margaret recognized from half-remembered dreams, Vera, the carnival woman, unchanged by the 50 years that had aged Margaret into an old woman. "Time moves differently when you dance with magic," Vera said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority Margaret remembered from that desperate night in 1973. "What feels like decades to you has been merely moments to those of us who exist between the seconds." Frank's grip on Margaret's shoulder tightened. She could feel his confusion, his struggle to process what his restored mind was witnessing, but also his determination to stand with her regardless of where this path led. "You said I would forget," Margaret said to Vera. "You said it was a mercy." It was. Could you have lived these 50 years? Could you have loved your husband, raised your daughter, built your life, knowing that every moment of happiness was borrowed against an uncertain future? Vera gestured to the path stretching away from them. "But now the debt has awakened, and with it, your power to choose how it's paid." Margaret looked at the 5 paths, each one pulling at her with different promises and threats. One led toward brilliant light that hurt to look at directly. Another descended into gentle shadows that whispered of peace and forgetting. A third twisted back on itself in complex loops that suggested time moving backward. The fourth stretched straight ahead into what looked like ordinary countryside, but something about it felt false, too perfect. The fifth? The fifth path was narrow and difficult, winding between sharp rocks and thorny growth, but it led towards something that looked remarkably like home. "What do they mean?" Frank asked, his voice strained but steady. Vera looked at him with something approaching sympathy. "Each path represents a way to resolve the bargain. The first offers transcendence. Margaret joins the magic completely, becomes one of us, and in doing so ensures your restoration is permanent. The second provides release. You both forget this ever happened, return to the life you had, accept the natural progression of things." Margaret felt her heart clench. "The third?" "Undoes the original choice entirely. Your son Tommy lives. Your grief never drives you to seek magical intervention. But everything that came after, your daughter Sarah, your grandchildren, the shape of the life you've built, disappears as if it never was." The weight of that possibility nearly drove Margaret to her knees. To save Frank by unmaking Sarah's entire existence felt like a betrayal beyond comprehension. "The fourth," Vera continued, "creates a perfect simulation. You live in a world where Frank is healthy, where neither of you ages, where loss never touches you again. But it isn't real. You become prisoners of comfort, cut off from the genuine world and everyone in it." Frank stepped closer to Margaret, their bodies nearly touching. "And the fifth path?" Vera's expression grew complex, mixing approval with concern. "The most dangerous one. You challenge the terms of the original bargain itself. You argue that 50 years of not knowing should have taught the magic something about the nature of human love. That true love doesn't demand impossible choices. It's never been tried before. It could free you both, or it could destroy everything you're trying to protect." Margaret looked at Sorrow, who watched the proceedings with ancient patience. "What would you choose?" she asked the creature who had been both gift and burden. "I would choose the path that honors what you've learned," Sorrow replied. "You've discovered that love isn't about holding on at any cost. It's about trusting that what's real between two people can survive even the worst losses." Behind them, Margaret heard something impossible, the sound of their farmhouse door opening, and Sarah's voice calling out, "Mom? Dad? Your car's here, but you're not answering." Their daughter had driven up from Des Moines, 3 hours away, with no way of knowing what was happening in their barn. "She'll come looking for us," Frank said quietly. Margaret nodded, understanding that their choice would affect not just them, but everyone who loved them. The magic wasn't just asking what she was willing to sacrifice, it was asking what kind of future she was willing to fight for. She stepped toward the fifth path, the dangerous one, with Frank beside her and their real life waiting just beyond the barn walls. The fifth path stretched before them like a challenge written in stone and shadow. Margaret felt the weight of Vera's warning settle into her bones. It's never been tried before, but Sarah's voice calling from the house reminded her that some risks were worth taking when the stakes included not just her own future, but her daughter's right to keep both her parents. "Wait," Frank said, his hand catching her arm before she could take another step. "If this goes wrong, if we lose everything, Sarah will be alone. She'll have to deal with whatever consequences come without understanding why." Margaret turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same protective instinct that had made him a good father, a devoted husband, a man who'd spent 40 years ensuring their family felt safe. Even now, with his memories restored and his mind clear, his first thought was for their daughter's well-being. "She's stronger than we think," Margaret said softly. "We raised her to be." But doubt crept into her voice even as she spoke. Sarah was strong, yes, but she was also their child. 50 years old and accomplished, but still the girl who'd crawled into their bed during thunderstorms, who'd called them first when her marriage fell apart, who drove 3 hours on a Saturday just to check on them. "The magic feeds on certainty," Sorrow's voice whispered in Margaret's mind. "Doubt weakens the foundation of any spell. If you choose this path, you must choose it completely." Vera stepped closer, her ageless face grave. "The child, your daughter, she'll be at risk regardless of which path you choose. The magic has touched your family now. It won't simply disappear if you walk away." "What do you mean?" Frank's voice carried the sharp edge of parental alarm. "Did you think the restoration of your memories came without cost? The spell has been drawing power from somewhere. Each day your mind grew clearer. Each moment of recovered past, that energy had to come from the life force closest to you. Your daughter has been growing weaker, though she probably attributes it to stress, to worry about your condition." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She thought of Sarah's phone calls over the past week, how tired her daughter had sounded, how she'd mentioned having trouble sleeping, losing her appetite. Margaret had assumed it was concern about Frank's declining health. She'd never imagined, "How long does she have?" The question tore from Margaret's throat. "Without intervention? Perhaps a month. The magic will continue drawing from her until your husband's restoration is complete, or until there's nothing left to draw from." The paths in front of them suddenly looked different. The first path, transcendence joining the magic completely, would save Frank and Sarah both, but would cost Margaret her humanity. The second, forgetting, returning to their original lives, would restore Sarah's strength, but doom Frank to disappear again into the fog of disease. The third would unmake Sarah entirely. The fourth would trap them all in a beautiful lie. Only the fifth path offered the possibility of saving everyone, but at the cost of challenging forces older than civilization itself. Frank's breathing had grown rapid, his restored mind calculating the same terrible mathematics. "She's paying the price for my healing. Our daughter is dying because of something I can't even control." "Because of something I chose," Margaret corrected, the guilt settling into her chest like a physical weight. 50 years ago, and again when I decided to trust the magic instead of questioning it." From the direction of the house, Sarah's voice called again. "Closer now, Mom? Your car's in the driveway, but the house is empty. Are you in the barn?" They had minutes, maybe less, before Sarah discovered them standing in what would look like an empty horse stall but felt like the crossroads of fate itself. Margaret imagined trying to explain this to her daughter. The magic, the bargain, the choice that would determine whether Sarah lived to see another month. "She'll think we've lost our minds," Frank said quietly, echoing Margaret's thoughts. "Maybe we have." Margaret looked at each path again, weighing love against loss, hope against hubris. "But if we're going to lose our minds, let's lose them together." She took Frank's hand, feeling the familiar calluses from decades of carpentry work, the wedding ring worn smooth by time and labor. Whatever happened next, they would face it as they'd faced everything else, as partners who'd chosen each other again and again across the years. "The fifth path," Margaret said to Vera, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We challenge the bargain." Vera nodded slowly, something that might have been approval flickering in her ancient eyes. "Then you must be prepared to argue your case before powers that have never been successfully challenged. You must convince entities older than human civilization that love itself can evolve, can teach even magic something new about the nature of sacrifice and devotion." Sarah's footsteps crunched on the gravel outside the barn. Margaret squeezed Frank's hand and stepped onto the narrow, dangerous path that led toward an uncertain future, but one they would write together. The moment their feet touched the fifth path, the world exploded into sensation and memory. Margaret felt herself pulled backward and forward through time simultaneously, her consciousness stretched across decades like taffy. She saw herself at 23, standing in a carnival tent thick with incense and desperation, begging a stranger to save her dying son. She saw Frank at 75, lost in a fog of confusion, unable to remember her name. She saw Sarah at 50, growing paler by the day as an invisible force drained her life to fuel her father's restoration. And beneath it all, threading through every moment, she felt the presence of something vast and ancient turning its attention toward them, like a mountain deciding to notice two ants on its slope. The path beneath their feet became less solid, more like walking on condensed starlight that threatened to dissolve with each step. Frank's hand in hers was the only anchor to reality as the space around them expanded into something that defied geometry, a courtroom that existed between dimensions, where the laws governing magic and mortality could be questioned. "State your challenge," a voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the weight of eons. Margaret couldn't see the speaker, but she felt its presence pressing against her mind like deep ocean water. "I challenge the assumption that love requires sacrifice," Margaret said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I challenge the belief that healing one person must damn another. I challenge the idea that bargains made in desperation should bind families across generations." The presence shifted, and Margaret felt its attention like sunlight through a magnifying glass, burning and intense. "Love has always required sacrifice. This is the foundation upon which all magic rests. To change this would unmake the fundamental order of things." Frank stepped forward, his grip on Margaret's hand tightening. "Then maybe it's time the fundamental order learned something new." Margaret felt a surge of pride at his words, even as terror clawed at her chest. This was her husband as she'd first fallen in love with him, the young man who'd stood up to her disapproving father, who'd challenged anyone who tried to diminish what they felt for each other. "You argue from ignorance," the presence continued, and now Margaret could sense others joining it, a council of entities older than recorded history, each one focused on the two mortals who dared question their authority. "Humans love for decades at most. We have observed love across millennia. We know its true nature." "But you've never experienced it," Margaret realized suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "You've watched it, measured it, cataloged it like specimens in a laboratory, but you've never felt what it means to choose someone new every day for 50 years. You've never experienced how love changes, deepens, becomes something more than the sum of its original parts." The space around them trembled, and Margaret felt anger radiating from the assembled powers. "Mortal presumption, your love is temporary, fragile, bounded by death and decay. Magic is eternal. Our love has outlasted everything you've thrown at it," Frank said fiercely. "Disease, loss, time itself trying to steal our memories. And it's not the same love we started with. It's been tested, broken, rebuilt, and it came back stronger each time. That's something your eternal magic has never learned how to do." Sarah's voice echoed strangely through the dimensional courthouse. "Mom? Dad? I'm getting worried now. Please answer me." Margaret felt the urgency of time running out, but also something else, a shift in the presence surrounding them, as if Frank's words had struck something unexpected. "You want to understand sacrifice?" she asked, pressing what might be their only advantage. "Then understand this, we're not here demanding to keep what the magic gave us. We're here offering to teach you what we've learned about love that grows stronger through loss, not weaker." "Explain," the voice commanded, and Margaret sensed genuine curiosity beneath the cosmic authority. "The magic assumes that loving someone means holding on at any cost," Margaret said. Memories of their 50 years together flowing through her like river water. But real love, the kind that lasts, learns when to hold tight and when to let go. It learns that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is accept loss rather than force someone else to pay the price of preventing it. She looked at Frank, seeing understanding dawn in his eyes. "If keeping his memories means our daughter dies, then we choose to let the memories go. If saving our daughter means accepting his disease, then we accept it. But if there's a third option, if love that's willing to sacrifice itself can teach your magic something new about the nature of devotion, then we offer ourselves as teachers, not supplicants." The presence fell silent, and in that silence, Margaret heard Sarah's footsteps entering the barn, moving toward the stall where her parents stood at the crossroads of everything they'd ever loved. The powers were considering their challenge, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Margaret realized that whatever came next would reshape not just their family's fate, but the very nature of magic itself. Sarah's footsteps stopped directly outside the stall. "Mom? Dad?" Her voice carried a note of panic now. "Your shoes are here by the door, but I can't find you anywhere." Margaret felt the dimensional courtroom begin to fracture around them. Through the cracks between realities, she could see her daughter's face, pale, drawn, the life force that had been sustaining Frank's recovery visibly draining from her features. Sarah looked exhausted in a way that went beyond mere tiredness, her eyes shadowed with the kind of fatigue that sleep couldn't touch. The presence surrounding them suddenly contracted, pressing down with the weight of a decision being made. When it spoke again, the voice carried a finality that made Margaret's bones ache. "Your offer is interesting," it said, "but insufficient." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She felt Frank's hand spasm in hers as the meaning sank in. They had gambled everything, on the hope that love could teach even ancient magic something new, and they had lost. "The fundamental laws cannot be changed by mortal sentiment," the presence continued remorselessly. "Magic requires balance. Life demands payment. Love, no matter how deep or enduring, cannot alter these truths. Your challenge is rejected." The paths beneath their feet began to dissolve, reality reasserting itself with cruel efficiency. Margaret felt herself falling back toward the ordinary world, but not gently, like a stone dropped from a great height, gathering speed toward an impact that would shatter everything. "Wait!" she cried out, but her voice was already becoming thin, distant. "The bargain, what happens to Sarah?" "The restoration of your husband's mind will be completed," the voice replied with cosmic indifference. "The debt will be paid in full. Your daughter's life force will be consumed to the last drop, as was always intended. The magic takes what it is owed." "No!" Frank's anguished shout tore through the dissolving courtroom. "Take me instead. Take us both. Don't punish her for our choices." But the presence was already withdrawing, their attention turning away like stars going dark. Margaret felt the last of the dimensional space collapse around them, dumping them back into the harsh reality of hay and horsehair, old wood, and the scent of impending loss. They were standing in sorrow's stall again, but everything had changed. The horse was gone, not vanished, but transformed back into what she had always truly been, a conduit for forces beyond human comprehension. In her place stood a creature of shadow and starlight that hurt to look at directly. Sarah stood in the doorway of the stall, her face blank with shock. She could see them now, really see them, and see what they were facing. "What?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What is that thing?" Margaret tried to move toward her daughter, but found herself frozen in place. The shadow creature that had been sorrow spoke without words, its voice resonating directly in their minds. "The debt collection begins now." The borrowed time is over. Sarah swayed on her feet, one hand reaching out to steady herself against the stall door. As Margaret watched in horror, her daughter seemed to become translucent, as if she were slowly fading from existence entirely. Sarah. Margaret fought against the invisible bonds holding her, but she might as well have been trying to break chains of solid steel. Please, there has to be another way. Frank was struggling beside her, his restored memories now a curse that let him understand exactly what was happening to their child. 50 years, he said brokenly. 50 years, I got to live because of what Margaret chose, and now Sarah pays the price. This isn't love, it's selfishness wearing love's face. The shadow creature moved closer to Sarah, who was now barely solid enough to cast a reflection. Margaret could see through her daughter to the barn wall beyond, could watch her child disappearing piece by piece to fuel a restoration neither of them had asked for. I would rather forget you completely than watch her die, Margaret said to Frank, tears streaming down her face. I would rather lose every memory we've ever made together than lose her. I know, Frank replied, his own voice thick with grief. But it's too late for what we would rather do. The powers have made their choice, and we're out of options. Sarah's eyes found theirs across the impossible distance that now separated them. I love you both, she said, her words growing fainter as her form continued to fade. Whatever this is, whatever you did, I understand. Parents make impossible choices to protect their children. I forgive you. Margaret felt her heart break completely. Sarah was dying to save a father who would rather die himself than watch it happen, forgiving parents who had failed to protect her from forces they'd never fully understood. The shadow creature reached out one tendril of darkness toward Sarah's fading form, and Margaret knew that in moments, her daughter would be gone forever, consumed to complete a bargain that should never have been made. All their love, all their sacrifice, all their attempts to challenge the cosmic order had led to this, watching their child pay the ultimate price for their choices. Everything was lost. But as the shadow creature's tendril touched Sarah's translucent form, something impossible happened. Instead of draining away her remaining life force, the contact sparked, literally sparked, with points of light that crackled between them like electricity. The creature recoiled with what Margaret could only describe as surprise, its form wavering for the first time since the transformation had begun. What? Sarah gasped, looking down at herself. She was still fading, but the process had stopped. More than that, where the creature had touched her, she seemed slightly more solid than before. Margaret felt the invisible bonds holding her weaken. She took a desperate step forward, then another, reaching toward her daughter. Sarah, what did you feel when it touched you? Sarah's voice was stronger now, more present. I felt its hunger. But also, it felt mine. The shadow creature made a sound like wind through broken glass, something that might have been confusion or distress. When it spoke in their minds, its voice carried uncertainty. For the first time, this vessel resists consumption. Because she's not just a vessel, Margaret realized, the revelation hitting her like lightning. She's a mother, too. The truth struck her with devastating clarity. Sarah had a daughter of her own, Emma, 22 years old, working her first job in Chicago. Margaret had been so focused on saving her family that she'd forgotten Sarah was part of a chain of love that extended beyond them. The magic doesn't understand, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger as understanding flooded through her. It's designed to take from the next generation to heal the previous one. But what happens when that generation has already learned how to love forward instead of backward? Sarah straightened, becoming more solid with each word. Emma, she whispered. Oh God, I've been so tired lately, and I thought it might be affecting her somehow. The weird dreams I've been having about giving something away. Frank's eyes widened with comprehension. The magic can't complete the transaction because Sarah is simultaneously giving and receiving. She's both the daughter paying the price and the mother protecting her own child. The shadow creature writhed, its form becoming less stable. The pattern is disrupted. The debt flows in circles rather than lines. Margaret felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time since the cosmic powers had rejected their challenge. It's not just disrupted, it's evolved. 3 generations of love, each one protecting the next. Sarah won't let herself be consumed completely because her instincts as a mother won't allow it. And Emma's been sending me energy, Sarah said with dawning wonder. Every phone call, every text message asking if I'm okay. I thought she was just being sweet, but I've been feeling stronger after we talk. She's been fighting something she doesn't even understand, trying to protect me the way I tried to protect her when she was little. The creature was contracting now, its shadow form pulling inward as if something was draining it instead of feeding it. The magic cannot process. Circular love. Margaret understood now why their challenge had failed. The cosmic powers weren't wrong about magic requiring sacrifice. They were simply operating on an outdated model. They understood linear love, where parents sacrificed for children who grew up to sacrifice for their children in turn. But they had never encountered love that moved in multiple directions simultaneously, where each generation both gave to and received from the others. 50 years ago, I made a bargain to save someone I loved, Margaret said to the failing creature. But love didn't stop there. It kept growing, kept changing, kept finding new patterns. The magic you represent is ancient, but it's also rigid. It can't adapt. Sarah was almost fully solid now, color returning to her cheeks as the creature's hold on her life force weakened. What happens to it? She asked, looking at the writhing shadow with something that might have been pity. Frank moved to stand beside Margaret, taking her hand again. His memories were still intact, still clear. The creature hadn't had time to reverse its work before the pattern collapsed. I think, he said slowly, it learns, or it dies. Maybe for something this old, they're the same thing. The shadow creature gave one final pulse of darkness, and then simply dispersed. Not violently, not with drama, but like smoke finally finding an open window. In its wake, the air in the barn felt lighter, cleaner, free of the weight that had been pressing down on them. They stood in the sudden stillness. 3 generations of love having accidentally broken a pattern older than civilization, simply by refusing to let that love flow in only one direction. Sarah looked from Margaret to Frank, seeing them clearly for the first time. So, she said with a shaky laugh that was pure relief, does someone want to explain why Dad seems 20 years younger and why I just watched you both argue with a shadow monster about the nature of cosmic debt? Margaret looked at her husband, still healthy, still present, still frank, and at their daughter, alive and whole and safe. They had won not by challenging the magic directly, but by simply loving in a way that made the old magic obsolete. It's a long story, Margaret said, smiling through her tears, but we have time to tell it. For a long moment, they simply stood there in the ordinary barn, breathing in air that felt different somehow, lighter, as if a pressure they'd grown so accustomed to carrying had finally lifted. Margaret could hear the normal sounds of evening settling over the farm, crickets beginning their nightly chorus, the distant lowing of cattle from the Henderson place, the whisper of wind through the old oak tree that had shaded their kitchen window for decades. I need to sit down, Sarah said, and promptly lowered herself onto a hay bale, her legs apparently deciding they'd had enough of supporting her through impossible circumstances. And I need someone to start from the beginning, because my brain is trying to convince me that what just happened was some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Margaret looked at Frank, seeing her own mixture of relief and exhaustion reflected in his eyes. The crisis was over, but they were all still processing what had just occurred. The beginning, she said slowly, is 50 years ago, in this very barn, when I made a choice that I thought I'd forgotten. She moved to sit beside Sarah, suddenly aware of how much her own body ached. The confrontation with forces beyond human comprehension had taken more out of her than she'd realized. Frank settled on Sarah's other side, and for a moment they were simply 3 people trying to make sense of something that defied all reasonable explanation. There was a child, Margaret began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. A little girl, dying, and her grandmother desperate enough to make a bargain with something that promised it could help. I was the librarian, The one person in town who might know about such things, and I— She paused, remembering. I thought I was being wise, cautious. I made the bargain myself instead of letting an old woman sacrifice everything for her granddaughter. Sarah reached out and took her mother's hand. The horse, sorrow. That was part of it? The horse was the anchor, Frank said, his restored memories allowing him to piece together fragments that had been hidden for decades. A way for the magic to stay connected to our family, to this place. When your mother brought her home, it activated something that had been dormant for 50 years. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of understanding settle over them all. The magic needed payment for the life it had saved. It was supposed to take that payment from our children, from you. But when the time came, she looked at her daughter with wonder. You weren't just a child anymore. You were a mother yourself, part of a chain that the magic couldn't break. Emma, Sarah said softly. I need to call Emma. If this has been affecting our whole family, she has a right to know. She does, Margaret agreed. But first, we need to understand what happens now. The magic that was binding us is gone, but Frank's recovery, his memories— I think I'm keeping them, Frank said, flexing his fingers experimentally, as if testing whether his mind was still his own. Whatever the shadow creature did, it was completed before the pattern collapsed. I can remember everything. Our wedding day, Sarah's first steps, teaching her to drive. But I can also remember the dark years when my mind was slipping away piece by piece. Sarah squeezed her parents' hands. Then we're okay? Really okay? Margaret considered the question carefully. Were they okay? Frank's dementia had been reversed through magical intervention, but the entity that had powered that reversal was gone. Sarah was alive and healthy, but they'd all been exposed to forces that operated by rules entirely different from anything they understood. I think, Margaret said finally, that we're better than okay. We're free. It was true, she realized. For the first time in 50 years, her family wasn't bound by an ancient bargain or threatened by cosmic debt. They had faced powers older than civilization and emerged not because they were stronger, but because their love had evolved beyond what those powers could comprehend. There's something else, Frank said quietly. The journal you found, Margaret. I remember you writing in it all those years ago. But I also remember you hiding it, making sure it would be found when the time was right. Margaret frowned, trying to access memories that still felt foreign. I was preparing. Part of me knew this day would come, even if I couldn't consciously remember why. You left yourself breadcrumbs, Sarah said with a small smile. Even under magical influence, you were still a librarian. You documented everything. The thought warmed Margaret more than she expected. Even when cosmic forces had been manipulating her memory, her essential nature had found a way to preserve the truth for when it would be needed most. Standing up, Margaret felt strength returning to her limbs, purpose crystallizing in her mind. We have work to do, she said. Phone calls to make, stories to share, and a granddaughter who deserves to know that her family is part of something extraordinary. As they walked toward the house together, Margaret realized that for the first time in decades, she was genuinely excited about the future. They had gathered more than just strength. They had gathered themselves complete and whole and finally truly free. The house felt different as they approached it through the gathering dusk. Margaret couldn't quite put her finger on what had changed. The windows still glowed with the same warm light, the porch still creaked under their feet, and the familiar scent of Frank's forgotten coffee still lingered in the kitchen. But something fundamental had shifted, as if the very walls had exhaled a breath they'd been holding for 50 years. I'll make fresh coffee, Frank said, moving toward the kitchen with a purposefulness Margaret hadn't seen in years. Real coffee this time. My mind feels sharp, like I can finally think clearly again. Sarah settled into her mother's favorite armchair, pulling out her phone. I need to call Emma first. If she's been unconsciously fighting something magical to protect me, she deserves to know why she's been having those strange dreams. Margaret paused in the doorway, watching her daughter dial their granddaughter's number. The normalcy of it struck her as almost surreal. After facing cosmic entities and breaking ancient magical patterns, They were making coffee and phone calls like any other family on any other evening. Emma? Hi, sweetheart. No, everything's fine. Actually, better than fine. But I need to tell you something, and I need you to sit down first. Sarah's voice carried a warmth and strength that made Margaret's heart swell with pride. As Sarah began the impossible task of explaining magical bargains and shadow creatures to a 22-year-old in Chicago, Margaret moved to the kitchen where Frank was methodically measuring coffee grounds with the precision of someone who could finally trust his hands to remember how much was enough. "How much do you remember?" she asked quietly, not wanting to interrupt Sarah's call but needing to know how complete his restoration had been. Frank paused in his preparations, his eyes growing distant. "Everything. The good years and the lost ones. I remember the morning I couldn't remember how to tie my shoes. And I remember the afternoon last week when you read to me from that mystery novel and I couldn't follow the plot from one chapter to the next." His voice caught slightly. "I remember how hard you tried to hide how scared you were." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I thought I was losing you completely." "You were." He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "But you also never stopped believing there was something left worth saving. Even when I couldn't remember your name, you kept talking to me like I was still there." From the living room, they could hear Sarah's voice rising with gentle insistence. "Emma, I know it sounds impossible, but you've been having dreams about giving something away, haven't you? About feeling drained after phone calls with me? That wasn't your imagination." Margaret marveled at how readily Sarah had accepted the reality of what they'd experienced. But then again, Sarah had felt the magic's pull firsthand, had experienced the terrifying sensation of fading from existence. There was no room for denial when the evidence had been written in her own disappearing flesh. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked Frank. "We've spent so many years just trying to survive each day, trying to manage your condition. I'm not sure I remember how to plan for a future." Frank smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the man who had courted her 47 years ago in the Millbrook library, charming her with his earnest questions about local history and his infectious enthusiasm for small-town mysteries. "We learn," he said simply. "We figure out what it means to be ourselves again, and we make sure Emma knows she's part of something extraordinary, not something to be feared." Sarah's conversation was wrapping up, her voice filled with a mixture of apology and wonder. "I know it's a lot to process, sweetheart. Why don't you come visit next weekend? We can talk more then, and you can meet your grandfather, really meet him, for the first time since you were little." When Sarah joined them in the kitchen, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She believes me," she said with amazement. "I thought she'd think I was having some kind of breakdown, but she believes me. She said the dream stopped about an hour ago, and she felt like she could finally breathe properly for the first time in weeks." Margaret felt the last piece of worry ease from her shoulders. Emma was safe, Sarah was whole, and Frank was himself again. The magical crisis was truly over. "There's something else we need to discuss," Margaret said, her librarian instincts reasserting themselves now that the immediate danger had passed. "We broke something tonight, something ancient and powerful. There may be consequences we haven't thought of yet." Frank nodded, pouring coffee into 3 mismatched mugs. Other bargains that depended on the old patterns. Other magical entities that operated under the same rules we just made obsolete. Sarah accepted her coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. So this might not be the end of the story, it might be the beginning of a new chapter. Margaret looked at her family, her brilliant, brave daughter and her restored husband, and felt a fierce determination kindle in her chest. They had faced the impossible and emerged stronger. Whatever came next, they would face it together, armed with the knowledge that their love was more powerful than forces that had shaped human destiny for millennia. "Then we'd better get ready," she said. The first sign that their victory might not be complete came with the morning light. Margaret woke before dawn, pulled from sleep by a sensation she couldn't name, a subtle wrongness that made her skin prickle with unease. Beside her, Frank slept peacefully, his breathing deep and regular, still blessed with the restoration that had returned his mind to her. But something had changed in the night. something that made the very air feel charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. She slipped from bed and padded to the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, following a routine 40 years in the making. The view should have been familiar: their weathered barn, the pasture where sorrow had spent her final days, the distant line of trees marking the boundary of the Henderson farm. Instead, Margaret found herself staring at a landscape that looked subtly more. Colors seemed deeper, shadows held hints of movement that shouldn't exist, and the morning mist clung to the ground in patterns that suggested intention rather than random weather. Most unsettling of all, she could see other farms in the distance that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, structures that belonged to no neighbor she recognized, glowing with a faint luminescence that spoke of otherworldly origins. "Mom?" Sarah's voice came from behind her, heavy with sleep and concern. "Did you feel that?" Margaret turned to find her daughter standing in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. Sarah's face carried the same expression of alert wariness that Margaret felt settling into her own features. "You felt it too?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Whatever was happening affected them all. Like electricity in the air. Like the feeling you get right before a thunderstorm. Except... Sarah moved to stand beside her mother at the window. "Except it's not weather, is it? It's magical." Frank appeared moments later, his movements quick and purposeful in a way that still made Margaret's heart lift with gratitude. His mind might be restored, but his instincts remained sharp. "The phone's been ringing," he said without preamble. "Calls from numbers I don't recognize, but when I answer, there's no one there, just breathing, and something that might have been whispering." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. "How many calls?" "7. In the last hour. All from different area codes. Some I don't think exist." Sarah was still staring out the window, her body tense with concentration. "There are people walking across our pasture," she said quietly. "At least, I think they're people. They're too far away to be sure, but they're moving toward the house." Margaret looked where her daughter was pointing and saw them. 3 figures emerging from the morning mist, their movements somehow both purposeful and ethereal. They walked with the steady gait of those who had traveled far to reach this specific place, and as they drew closer, Margaret could see that they wore clothing from different eras. A woman in what appeared to be Victorian dress, a man in clothing that suggested the 1920s, and a third figure whose garments seemed to shift and change even as she watched. "They're not threatening," Frank observed, his restored analytical mind already working to assess the situation. "But they're not entirely human either." The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. Other bargain makers. "We didn't just break one magical contract last night. We broke the entire system, and now everyone else who was bound by similar arrangements is being affected." As if summoned by her words, the 3 figures paused at their fence line, close enough now for Margaret to see their faces clearly. They were indeed human, or had been once, but their eyes held depths that spoke of decades spent existing between worlds. The woman in Victorian dress raised one gloved hand in what might have been greeting or warning. "Margaret Whitmore," her voice carried across the distance with unnatural clarity. "We need to speak with you." Sarah instinctively moved closer to her parents. "Should we let them approach?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Every instinct honed by 40 years of small-town caution urged her to lock the doors and call the sheriff. But her newly awakened understanding of magical reality whispered that this was exactly what they had prepared for. The consequences Frank had predicted. The new chapter Sarah had anticipated. "They've come seeking answers," Margaret said, surprising herself with her certainty. "We broke something that affected more than just our family. These are people who have been living with their own impossible bargains, their own magical burdens. And now that the old system has collapsed, they need to know what comes next," Frank finished, understanding flooding his restored mind. Margaret straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility settle around her like a familiar cloak. 40 years as a librarian had prepared her for this moment, people coming to her with questions that had no easy answers, seeking guidance through territory that had never been mapped. "Then we'd better invite them in for coffee," she said, walking toward the door. It looks like our real test is just beginning. Margaret's hand froze on the doorknob, as the three figures stepped through the fence as if it were made of mist rather than solid wood. Up close, she could see that the Victorian woman's dress bore stains that might have been tears or blood. The 1920s man's face carried scars that seemed to shift and writhe in the morning light, and the third figure, now clearly a young girl of perhaps 16, flickered between solid form and translucency like a dying light bulb. "You destroyed everything," the Victorian woman said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. 50 years I've been bound to walk between the living and the dead, carrying messages for those who cannot cross over. 50 years of service, and now," she gestured helplessly at her flickering form, "now I don't know what I am." The scarred man stepped forward, his movements jerky as if fighting against invisible restraints. "The bargain that saved my son's life in 1924, it required me to take on the pain of others, to absorb their suffering so they could heal. I've carried the agony of thousands, but at least I knew why." His eyes, when they fixed on Margaret, burned with desperate intensity. "What happens to all that accumulated pain now? Where does it go?" Sarah moved protectively closer to her parents, but Margaret felt an unexpected calm settle over her. These weren't enemies, they were casualties of the same cosmic system that had trapped her family. But unlike her family, they'd been serving that system far longer, and their bonds ran deeper than anything Margaret had experienced. "You're afraid," Margaret said, recognition dawning. It wasn't anger driving these three figures, it was terror. The magic that defined your existence for decades just vanished overnight, and you don't know who you are without it. The flickering girl spoke for the first time, her voice barely a whisper that somehow carried across the yard with perfect clarity. "I died in 1967. Car accident. But my grandmother's grief was so strong, so pure, that she made a deal to keep part of me here. I've been her guardian angel, her link to the afterlife, for 56 years. Now I can feel myself unraveling." Frank stepped past Margaret, his movements careful but determined. "You're all connected to bargains that use the same source, the same entity that kept me trapped between sanity and madness." "The Weaver," the Victorian woman confirmed. "It called itself the Weaver of Fates, and it offered solutions to impossible problems. But every solution came with a price, and every price bound us deeper into its web." Margaret felt pieces clicking into place with the satisfying logic of a well-organized card catalog. "When we broke our bargain, we didn't just free ourselves. We severed the Weaver's anchor to this reality. All of its other contracts became unstable." "Unstable?" The scarred man laughed bitterly. "Try catastrophic. There are 17 of us in this county alone, all slowly dissolving as our binding magic fails. And that's just the ones we know about." Sarah was studying the three figures with the analytical intensity she'd inherited from both parents. "But you're here," she pointed out, "talking to us. If you were really dissolving, would you be coherent enough for conversation?" The girl's form solidified slightly at Sarah's words. We came here hoping you might know how to restore the old patterns. Your family was the epicenter of the collapse. We thought perhaps you could reverse what you'd done." Margaret felt her heart clench with unexpected sympathy. These people had found purpose in their magical servitude, meaning in their impossible circumstances. Now she was being asked to consider whether their liberation had been worth the cost. "No," Frank said firmly, reading her expression. "Margaret, no. We can't restore a system that fed on human desperation and bound people to servitude for decades. But we can't just let them fade away either," Margaret replied, her librarian instincts asserting themselves. "There has to be another answer, a third option." The Victorian woman's eyes sharpened with desperate hope. "What do you mean?" Margaret looked at the three figures, former servants of an entity that had shaped human destiny through carefully managed cosmic debt, and felt the same intuitive certainty that had guided her to sorrow's stall that first impossible morning. "The Weaver is gone," she said slowly, thinking aloud. "But you're still here, still partially bound to your purposes, your callings. What if the problem isn't that your magic is disappearing, but that it's trying to transform into something new? The scarred man shook his head violently. Impossible. Magic doesn't just change, it follows ancient laws, immutable patterns. Which we just proved weren't immutable at all, Sarah interrupted. When we chose love over obligation, we broke rules that had governed reality for generations. Why couldn't that create space for new rules? Better rules? The girl's form brightened, her translucency giving way to solid presence. You think we could be, what? Free to choose our purposes instead of being bound to them? Margaret nodded, feeling rightness settle into her bones like homecoming. I think, she said, that we're all about to discover what comes after impossible. The silence that followed Margaret's declaration stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibility and terror in equal measure. Then the Victorian woman stepped forward, her form wavering between substance and shadow. You speak of transformation as if it's simple, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. But what you're suggesting, it would mean releasing control entirely. No binding contracts, no guaranteed outcomes, just trust. Margaret felt the truth of it settle into her bones with the weight of absolute certainty. Yes, she said simply, trust. The scarred man's face contorted with anguish. The pain I carry, thousands of people suffering, absorbed into my flesh and spirit. If I release my binding to contain it, where will it go? Who will bear it? What if, Sarah said quietly, the question isn't who will bear it, but whether it needs to be born at all. Margaret watched her daughter's face as understanding dawned there. The same expression Sarah had worn as a child when solving particularly complex puzzles. The weaver's system required payment, required suffering as currency. But magic without that framework might work differently. Frank moved to stand beside his wife, his restored mind working through the implications with careful precision. Margaret, what you're proposing isn't just transformation, it's revolution, the complete overthrow of magical law as these people have known it for generations. The complete overthrow of magical tyranny, Margaret corrected, feeling fierce determination kindle in her chest. Look at them, Frank. Look at what the old system did. She gestured toward the three figures, the woman trapped between life and death for 5 decades, the man carrying centuries of accumulated agony, the girl who had never been allowed to properly die. This is what magical stability looks like, eternal servitude disguised as purpose. The girl suddenly gasped, her form brightening with unexpected solidity. I can feel it, she whispered. Something shifting inside me, like chains loosening. But even as hope flickered across her young face, Margaret felt a corresponding drain in her own chest, a pull that seemed to reach into the very core of her being and extract something essential. The transformation isn't free, the Victorian woman observed with growing alarm. Someone has to anchor it. Someone has to pay the price of rewriting reality itself. Margaret understood before the words finished forming. The knowledge arrived not as thought, but as bone-deep certainty, the same intuitive understanding that had guided every choice since she'd first seen sorrow in that auction barn. It has to be me, she said quietly. No, Frank's voice cracked like a whip. Absolutely not. We didn't fight to save our family just to lose you to another magical bargain. It's not a bargain, Margaret said, already feeling the pull growing stronger, more insistent. It's a choice, my choice. She turned to face her husband and daughter, memorizing their faces with desperate intensity. The old system required unwilling sacrifice, coerced payment. What I'm offering is freely given. Sarah stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Mom, there has to be another way. Some other solution? There is no other way, sweetheart. Margaret felt pieces of herself beginning to dissolve at the edges, her essence flowing outward to provide the foundation for new magical laws built on love rather than obligation. But this isn't loss. This is becoming something larger. The air around them began to shimmer with nascent possibility. The three figures, no longer bound servants but free agents of their own magical purposes, stood straighter as true choice returned to them for the first time in decades. The scarred man's face, smoothed as accumulated suffering, transformed from burden to healing power he could direct as he saw fit. The Victorian woman's dress brightened from funeral black to deep purple, her role shifting from unwilling messenger to chosen guardian of those caught between worlds. But the cost was Margaret herself, dissolving particle by particle into the magical matrix that would govern this new reality. She felt her consciousness expanding, touching every corner of their transformed landscape, becoming the foundation upon which others could build freely chosen lives. "I love you," she whispered to Frank and Sarah, her voice already echoing from everywhere and nowhere as her physical form began to fade. "Remember that love is always stronger than obligation. Always." Frank reached for her desperately, but his hands passed through air that sparkled with residual magic. "Margaret, please." "Take care of each other," she said, her presence growing diffuse but somehow more real, more essential than physical substance had ever been. "And remember, this isn't goodbye. I'm not disappearing. I'm becoming part of everything." The last thing she saw was Frank and Sarah holding each other as dawn broke over a world forever changed, where magic served love instead of enslaving it, where sacrifice was choice rather than compulsion. Margaret Whitmore, retired librarian, had written the final entry in her impossible story, not with ink on paper, but with her very being inscribed into the fundamental laws of reality itself. The victory was complete, the cost had been paid, and love, as always, endured. The silence that followed Margaret's transformation felt alive with possibility, heavy with the weight of a world fundamentally altered. Frank stood frozen in the spot where he'd last touched air that had once been his wife's hand, his restored mind struggling to process what his eyes had witnessed. Sarah pressed close against his side, both of them staring at the space where Margaret had stood moments before, space that now shimmered with gentle luminescence as if lit from within by some benevolent star. "She's really gone," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking on the words. But even as grief threatened to overwhelm them, Frank felt something else stirring in the transformed air around them, a presence that was both utterly familiar and completely new, Margaret's essence woven into the very fabric of their reality, no longer constrained by physical form, but somehow more present than she'd ever been. The three figures who had come seeking answers stood transfixed, their own transformations still rippling through them in waves of visible change. The Victorian woman's dress had settled into rich purple silk, and when she moved, it was with the fluid grace of someone finally free to choose her own steps. The scars on the man's face had faded to silver lines that caught the morning light like jewelry, and his posture spoke of burdens willingly carried rather than imposed. The girl appeared fully solid now, no longer flickering between states but glowing with the steady radiance of someone who had found peace between worlds. "I can feel her," the girl said softly, wonder coloring her voice. "She's everywhere. In the air, in the light, in the space between heartbeats." Frank closed his eyes and reached out with senses he hadn't known he possessed until this moment. There, in the way the breeze carried the scent of coming rain, in the particular quality of sunlight filtering through clouds, in the rhythm of his own heartbeat, Margaret's presence surrounded them like an embrace that would never end. "She kept her promise," he said, understanding flooding through him with the force of revelation. "She said this wasn't goodbye. She meant it literally." Sarah's tears had slowed, replaced by something that might have been awe. The journal, she breathed. All those entries she wrote but couldn't remember. She was preparing for this, learning how to exist as story itself, as narrative given form. The Victorian woman approached them carefully, her movements respectful of their grief while urgent with need for understanding. "What she's done, this transformation of magical law itself, it's creating ripples across everything. I can sense others like us throughout the region, all feeling the same shift, the old bindings dissolving, new possibilities emerging. But they'll be afraid," the scarred man added, his voice gentle with hard-won wisdom. "Change this fundamental terrifies even those who have suffered under the old ways. They'll need guidance, examples of how to navigate freedom after generations of servitude." Frank felt Margaret's presence pulse around them with warm approval, and suddenly he understood what she had seen, what she had chosen to become. Not just the foundation for new magical laws, but the author of a story that would teach others how to write their own. She didn't just break the system, he said with growing wonder. She rewrote the entire genre, from tragedy to... He struggled for words adequate to the magnitude of what his wife had accomplished. Romance, Sarah finished quietly. Not romantic love, but the deeper meaning. A story where individual choice triumphs over cosmic fate, where love redefines the rules of reality itself. The girl laughed suddenly, the sound bright as silver bells in the morning air. "I can go home," she said with dawning amazement. "Not because I'm bound to my grandmother's grief, but because I choose to comfort her, because love makes that choice meaningful. And I can heal," the scarred man added, flecks of his hands revealing palms that no longer bore the stigmata of others' pain. "Not as a magical mandate, but as a gift I decide how to share." "We all can," the Victorian woman said, her eyes bright with tears that spoke of 50 years' worth of suppressed hope finally allowed to surface. "We can all choose our own stories now." Frank felt the truth of it settling into his bones with the same certainty that had guided Margaret to every impossible decision since sorrow had first entered their lives. They stood at the center of a new world, one where magic served joy rather than enslaving it, where sacrifice became gift rather than theft. "Then we'd better start teaching," he said, feeling Margaret's presence warm around him like approval given form. "There will be others coming. Others who need to learn how freedom works after lifetimes of magical bondage." Sarah nodded, wiping away tears that had transformed from grief to gratitude. "We'll help them understand what Mom showed us, that the most powerful magic isn't in the binding, but in the choice to let go." Above them, clouds parted to reveal sky the color of infinite possibility, and Frank could swear he heard Margaret's laughter in the wind, not the echo of memory, but the living sound of love that had found a way to transcend every limitation, even death itself. The sky remained that impossible shade of infinite blue as Frank and Sarah walked slowly back toward the farmhouse, their steps measured and deliberate, as if they were learning to move through an entirely new world, which Frank supposed they were. The three transformed figures had departed to begin their own journeys of discovery, carrying with them the revolutionary understanding that magic could serve joy rather than demand sacrifice. But their leaving hadn't diminished Margaret's presence. If anything, it had grown stronger, more defined, like a radio signal finally tuned to perfect clarity. "I keep expecting her to be in the kitchen," Sarah said as they approached the weathered porch steps. "Making coffee, organizing something that doesn't need organizing, humming off-key while she reads the newspaper." Frank paused at the door, his hand resting on wood that felt warm to the touch despite the morning chill. "She will be," he said with quiet certainty. Not the way she was, but present, available, just differently accessible. The farmhouse welcomed them with familiar creaks and sighs, but underneath those ordinary sounds, Frank detected something new, a subtle harmony, as if the building itself had learned to sing. Sarah moved through the rooms with careful reverence, touching surfaces that seemed to pulse gently under her fingertips. "The journal," she said suddenly, turning toward the stairs. "I want to read the rest of it, to understand what she knew, what she planned." They found the leather-bound book exactly where Margaret had left it, open on her writing desk to a page covered in her careful script. But as Frank leaned over his daughter's shoulder to read, he realized the words were shifting, rearranging themselves even as they watched. "Today I am learning to exist as story itself," the text read, the handwriting definitely Margaret's, but somehow more luminous than ink on paper should have been. "Frank will worry that I've left him, but how can someone leave when they've simply expanded to fill all available space? I am in every book he'll ever read again, every sunset that reminds him of possibilities, every moment when Sarah discovers something wonderful about herself." Sarah's breath caught. She's still writing, even now. New words appeared as they watched. "Death, I'm discovering, is not the opposite of life. It's simply life's boldest choice to transform. I spent 40 years caring for others, and now I get to care for everything. Not as obligation, but as the deepest expression of love I've ever known. Frank sank into the chair beside the desk, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Margaret had become. She always said retirement would give her time for the projects she'd never finished. I don't think either of us imagined this scale. Sarah laughed through fresh tears, the sound carrying notes of wonder alongside grief. She's become the universe's librarian, organizing reality itself, making sure everyone can find exactly the story they need. They spent the morning reading, as Margaret's consciousness continued to communicate through the journal, sharing glimpses of her expanded existence. She described sensing others throughout the Midwest who were discovering their own freedom from magical servitude, guiding them toward choices that served love rather than fear. She wrote of touching the dreams of grieving grandmothers and lonely healers, showing them possibilities they'd never dared imagine. The beautiful thing about existing as story, she explained in script that seemed to glow with its own light, is that stories can be everywhere at once. I can hold Frank when his memories of dementia create nightmares, encourage Sarah through every challenge she'll face building her practice, and simultaneously help a frightened girl in Wisconsin learn to use her gift of prophecy as blessing rather than curse. As afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting everything in honey-colored radiance, Frank found himself talking aloud to the presence that suffused their home. He told Margaret about the practical concerns, how he'd manage the farm alone, whether he should sell Sorrow's empty stall, what to tell the neighbors who'd noticed unusual changes in their family dynamic. The journal's pages rustled without breeze, and new words appeared. The stall stays empty for now. It's become a doorway between possibilities. The neighbors will understand as much as they're ready to understand, and no more. As for managing alone, darling, you've never been alone a single day since we met. That hasn't changed. Sarah looked up from a passage describing the quantum mechanics of love-based magic. I want to learn, she announced. Whatever you've become, however you exist now, I want to understand it enough to help others find their way. The response came immediately. Then start by teaching what you already know, that healing happens not when we fix people, but when we love them into discovering their own wholeness. The rest will follow. Frank felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of grief that he realized wasn't loss but transformation. Margaret wasn't gone. She had simply become available to him in a way that transcended every limitation their physical marriage had ever faced. She was his wife still, but also the wind that would always carry messages between them, the intuition that would guide his choices, the presence that would ensure he never faced another day without feeling utterly, completely loved. Thank you, he whispered to the light-filled air. The house hummed with contentment, and somewhere in that cosmic harmony, Frank heard the unmistakable sound of Margaret's laughter, infinite, joyous, and eternally, impossibly present. 3 months later, Frank stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Sarah arrange flowers from Margaret's garden, flowers that bloomed with impossible vibrancy despite the approaching Iowa winter. The roses held colors he'd never seen before, deep purples that shifted to gold in certain light, whites that seemed to contain entire galaxies in their petals. Sarah had taken extended leave from her practice to help him adjust, but they both knew her real purpose was learning to navigate the transformed reality Margaret had created. The Hendersons stopped by while you were in town, Sarah said, not looking up from her arrangement. Their granddaughter started speaking in 3 languages she's never learned. They wanted to know if we'd noticed anything unusual lately. Frank smiled, feeling Margaret's presence pulse with gentle amusement around them. What did you tell them? That love creates miracles when we stop trying to control how they appear. Sarah finally met his eyes. Mrs. Henderson nodded like that explained everything. Mr. Henderson asked if we had any more of Mom's tea. The journal had explained this phenomenon. Margaret's influence spreading through their community in widening circles, touching everyone ready to accept that reality could be kinder than they'd previously imagined. Children were displaying gifts their parents recognized as blessings rather than burdens. Elderly couples were rediscovering romance they'd thought lost to time. Even the stubborn Johnson Farm's barren fields had begun producing vegetables that healed minor ailments when consumed with genuine gratitude. Frank moved to the window overlooking Sorrow's empty stall. The space had become exactly what Margaret promised, a doorway between possibilities. Yesterday he'd watched young Tommy Peterson sitting in the straw, apparently having a serious conversation with empty air. When Frank checked later, the boy's chronic asthma had simply vanished. The child's explanation to his bewildered parents was simple: "The nice lady in the barn taught me how to breathe with my whole heart." Dr. Everett called again. Sarah continued, her voice carefully neutral. "She wants to study what she calls our miraculous recovery pattern. Apparently word about our family has reached the University of Iowa Medical Center." Frank chuckled, remembering Margaret's predictions about this development. Scientists will try to measure love with instruments designed for fear, she'd written just last week. Let them look. Some discoveries require the observer to be transformed by the observation. What did you tell her? That she's welcome to visit, but she'll need to leave her preconceptions at the door. Sarah moved to stand beside him at the window. The journal says she's carrying grief about her brother's death that's blocking her from accepting any healing she can't quantify. But apparently, spending time here will help her understand that some medicine works precisely because it can't be replicated in laboratory conditions. Through the window, Frank watched autumn light dance across surfaces that seemed to sing with Margaret's joy. The farm had become a pilgrimage site without advertising itself as one. People simply found themselves drawn here when ready to discover that their own limitations might be more negotiable than they'd believed. The journal lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with Margaret's continuing observations of her expanded existence. Today's entry described guiding a young father in Nebraska through the choice to heal his daughter's leukemia, through love rather than desperation. Yesterday she'd written about comforting a widow in Minnesota who was learning to communicate with her deceased husband through the grammar of shared memories. "I understand now why some stories take lifetimes to write properly," the latest passage read. "I needed to live 40 years as Margaret the woman before I could become Margaret the narrative force. Every small choice to love despite difficulty, every moment I chose Frank's well-being over my own fear, every time I trusted kindness over certainty, all of it was practice for learning to rewrite reality itself." Frank sat at the table, running his fingers over words that felt warm to the touch. "I dreamed about you last night," he told the presents that filled their kitchen like sunlight. "We were dancing at our wedding again, but this time the music came from everywhere, from the walls, from our heartbeats, from the spaces between moments." The journal's pages rustled, new words appearing in script that seemed to shimmer. "Not a dream, darling. A memory of what's always been true. We've been dancing together since the day we met. I've just learned new steps." Sarah moved to embrace her father, both of them feeling Margaret's arms join their circle in a way that transcended physical sensation. Outside, the first snow of the season began falling, each flake catching light as if stars had decided to visit Earth personally. "I'm ready to go back to my practice," Sarah said quietly, "but not to fix people, to help them remember they were never broken." Frank nodded, understanding that his daughter had learned the most important lesson Margaret could teach, that healing meant witnessing wholeness, not imposing cure. Around them, the farmhouse hummed with infinite contentment, and in that cosmic harmony, Frank heard Margaret's laughter weaving itself permanently into the fabric of everything they would ever touch. Their new beginning had no ending, only endless, evolving love.